Welcome to Mystara for another riveting episode, where today it's all about the Western Defense League. Created from the political fallout after the events of Wrath of the Immortals, this episode includes the 1010 timeline, where Alphatia and Alfheim fall, and the 1005 timeline, where the Great Empires remain, but the Shadow Elves have claimed a reshaped Broken Lands for their own. Both versions of the League feature Darrican and Karamikos as the founding members, but the other members vary from timeline to timeline. So is the League just words on a piece of paper, or the beginning of a new empire in the known world? Well, stay tuned and find out. I'm Mr. Welch, and today we're having it both ways. The first appearance of the Western Defense League was in the Poor Wizard's Almanacs, where, after the fall of Alphatia and the crippling of Thyatis, Darrican joins with Karamikos as the founding members along with Rockholm, Yalarum, and the Five Shires. Alfheim is gone by this time, and Eärendil, Glantry, the Northern Reaches, and the Minrathad Guild stay neutral. As this uses the original Etruscan gazetteer, the Etruscan never factor in any aspect of the known world's politics. The primary reason for the League's founding is to prevent attacks from a large hostile force. For example, Thyatis or the Master returns, seeking to expand their borders, all the nations would band together and fight back. Of course, Thyatis is a shell of itself because of the war, and the Master was driven off during the events of Wrath of the Immortals, so the League is fairly secure in their goals. Rather than their stated goals, the main threat to the Defense League comes from the increasing chaos happening in around Glantry, the Broken Lands and the humanoids fleeing from them, and the Shadow Elf menace in Angmor. The Shadow Elves don't know what to do with Darrican. Once they have their homeland, they just become insular and focus instead on increasing their territory in the world below, rather than expanding their surface borders. The forces of the Master are still a threat, but with his defeat during the war, the threat isn't nearly as much as it was during the events of the Desert Nomad series. Thar, having lost most of his power in the Broken Lands, is a major threat as he rampaged across Darrican to reach the Northern Reaches to re-establish his power. The League is not a formal structure like NATO or the EU, but more of a mutual defense pact. Karamikos is under no obligation to purchase goods exclusively from Darrican to the exclusion of the Minrathad guilds. The League was more of a reaction against the aggression of Thyatis and the Master than a formal organization. But it does become a powerful force after the war because they came through some of the tumultuous times relatively intact. While Darrican suffered some damage during their brief war with the Master, the Great Meteor hit Glantry instead of them. Darrican is able to quickly recover from the war, and once that happens, they can start flooding the shattered Thaetian economy with cheap trade goods, or start sending medicine and clerical items to the plague-ravaged Glantry. Karamikos found itself one of the most powerful military forces in the known world by default because of the defeats of Thyatis and Ethengar. So what does this mean for the Western nations in the 1010 timeline? Not much, really. Yes, the nations will grow stronger through their mutual cooperations, but none of them have any intention of expanding, and the threat to them are minimum. Neither Corwin Monty or Stefan Karamikos have any desire to build an empire, nor do the Yalari, the Dwarves, or the Hin. The Five Shires might have to rein in raiding allied shipping, but other than that, it's business as usual among all the League nations. The problem with the 1010 WDL is it's tied to the biggest problem Mystara had after Wrath of the Immortals and the resulting timeline. Most of the external tension was destroyed in Wrath, and the Poor Wizard's Almanac confirmed that with almost all the conflict internalized between nations, there's not a lot of interaction between the former rivals. The Cold War between the great empires was concluded. Thyatis was a burned-out husk, and as far as anybody could tell, Alphatia was at the bottom of the ocean. The Master's armies were shattered and retreating back to Hul. Thar had given up the Broken Lands and any dreams of his legions, and the humanoids were Glantry's problem now. You have an alliance of good guy nations after the Great War, but all the bad guy nations are gone or behaving themselves. Even the Shadow Elves are more isolationist than an actual imperial threat. If you go by the 1005 timeline from the War on All Sides alternate history supplement available on the Vaults of Pandius, the Western Defense League takes on a larger role with increased membership. This also ties into the revised Etruscan sourcebook, also found on the Vaults of Pandius, which greatly expands on those people. It turns the Western Alliance from a loose defensive agreement to nations with a shared defense and a recent history of standing shoulder to shoulder against the Master's armies. While the Western Alliance has increased in power, it also has a lot more internal strife and external threats to deal with. To summarize the differences between the 1005 and 1010 timelines, in 1005 the War of the Master was much more brutal than the original timeline. More nations were drawn into the war, with Etruscan having multiple tribes joining both sides of the war, with the Tiger clan helping the Master and the Turtle and Horse clans joining the allied forces. Eärendil, Veslan, and Rockholm also committed forces for their own reasons, while the Shadow Elves were reluctant combatants, swayed by the promise of a surface homeland after the war was done. The alliance became twice the size as the 1010 timeline, with the enigmatic Ethengar and even Alphatians lending their militaries to defeat the Master's armies at the end of the war. After the hostilities had concluded, the allied nations realized the dangers of the empires and agreed to a formal treaty to provide military support in case of another catastrophic war. Darrakan is naturally the driving force behind the League, though they're under new leadership with the death of Monty during the siege of Darrakan City. Darrakan and the Five Shires were both brutalized during the war and need the help of their neighbors just to feed themselves initially. Karamikos, again, survived both wars relatively intact, with even von Hendrix becoming a surprise hero during the conflict, though not through any actual real loyalty to now King Stefan. As Alfheim still remains, they became the third signing member, and then the Five Shires joined. For the new members, the Turtle Clan of Etrugan effectively became their own nation by joining the League without the support of their cousins. The government of Irendi, shamed by their own people for not helping out, took up arms against the Master, and then joined the League, though they can only offer their substantial naval forces. Vestland was looking to get away from its barbaric past and joins the League looking for a financial advantage. The request of the Shadow Elves of New Angmar come as a complete surprise, as they were just considered isolationists up until that point. However, Queen Tanadelio doesn't trust the Sylvan Elves and joins the League just to keep an eye on them. The nation of Yelarum did not play a major role in the war due to constant vigilance because of the battles between Thyatis and Alphatia on their borders. Combined with the internal strife because of multiple changes in leadership for the various different reasons, that left the nation staying neutral while it got its affairs in order first. Rockholm is friendly with the League, and it will provide troops to assist in return for compensation, but the dwarves can't be bothered to mess with problems outside their borders, which is pretty typical for Rockholm, actually. The 1005 Defense League has many more threats because of several known and unknown factors. The Desert Nomads still have a large force to the west that retreated from the war, but not entirely. The Tiger Clan has revealed themselves to be a danger to surrounding areas, and committed numerous atrocities against the Hind during the conflict. Thyatis is looking to expand after the conclusion of the war with Alphatia. While Karamikos is safe because of their long-standing friendship with Thyatis, Osland has already become a puppet state of Emperor Eusebius, and he is looking for new areas to acquire to help with the massive debt the war created. To the north, the Ethengar have not revealed the target of their next invasion, but they're currently satiated with the treasure they took from the Master. The League does have a small defensive force comprised of volunteer troops from every member nation, and it trains the soldiers in the ways of all the other armies. Karamikan Knights coordinate with Darrakinian pikes. You'll have Hin skirmishers providing covering fire for advancing Veslandic Huskarls. The Irendi Navy will provide transportation for elves of both of the different nations, though not on the same ship. The League has more than enough military strength to keep even the legions of Thyatis at bay for now, but they would much rather keep Thyatis friendly to their needs. Their biggest issues right now are rebuilding the portions of Darrakan and the Shire savaged by the war, then the eradication of the Tiger Clan as an external threat to other nations, and finally the liberation of Sind from the remnants of the Master's army. To this end, every nation has provided supplies and volunteers for the rebuilding. The armies of the League also patrol the western borders along the edges of Sind and Etrugan in case the hostilities there ramp up again. The Western Defense League in its original form suffered the problems created during the TSR nuke phase when the big threats in Mystara largely worked themselves out. You had a 5-nation military alliance with no one actually big enough to threaten them. Thyatis was crippled by a war and a plague. Ethengar was emasculated, fighting in Helden. Glantry internalized its conflicts. The Shadow Elves refused to come out of their forest, and the Master was defeated. There was no external threat, so what was the point? The 1005 timeline still had Thyatis as a major power. The Master's armies were defeated, but not destroyed. The Tiger Clan was a serious menace that had to be dealt with after numerous atrocities during the war. All this was in addition to the fact that Darrakan and the Shires were half burned to the ground due to the ravages of the Master and the Tiger Clan. Now the League gave players a reason to work together through a multinational force against enemies that threatened them all. Thus concludes the Western Defense League. It was an attempt to bring various nations together, but it needed an external threat to justify its existence. The Alternate Defense League has similar threats, but the biggest issue is that one of the largest members of the organization needs help rebuilding itself, making the other nations carry the brunt of the initial duties at first. What will become of it depends on the threats that will shape it. Next week, I'm looking at a conceptual topic, the nations of Eastern Skothar. This was a project I was working on, trying to build up a similar number of nations to the known world in a region in Eastern Skothar, but only using primarily African nations and folklore. But until next week, remember to retaliate first. That way you're one up on the other guy.